Is this the end of Chainsaw Man? People have been saying Chainsaw Man Part 2 is ending for over a year, so we're all wondering when it's actually going to end. But what everyone really wants to know is if this is really the end of Chainsaw Man. Fans have debated whether Part 2 would be the end of Chainsaw Man since its debut, but now that it feels like we're in the final arc of Part 2, nobody is sure that there will really be a Part 3. And when you really think about it, it really comes down to the same question. Is this the end for Denji? That's why in this video, I'm going to speculate on how many chapters Part 2 has left, discuss the reception of both the anime and the manga over the last couple of years, and offer my theory for why I think Denji still has one part left. Just be warned that this video will probably contain some spoilers. Now, we all know Part 2 has to end at some point, so before we get into the potential for Part 3, let's talk about what the timeline for Part 2 looks like. Normally, I would start by talking about what we have left to do in the story, but if you read Chainsaw Man, you know that it's kind of hard to predict what's gonna happen in the story. Like the time everyone thought there was gonna be a big Gun Devil arc, and then Makima was like, yeah, he's dead, I lied. Or the time everyone thought there was gonna be a big Hell arc in Part 2, and now we're over 100 chapters in, and that's probably not happening. So while there are a bunch of great theories out there, and I would like to talk about exactly how I think things will end, I think it's more important that we figure out when it's gonna end first. Because if we know how long we have left, then that gives us a better idea of what we can expect to happen. The problem is, there's no way to know for sure. Sometimes Shueisha will make an announcement that a series is ending a year before it happens, and sometimes they make an announcement a lot less than a year. So for this part, we have to look at other manga and sort of make an educated guess. To start, let's look at some other Jump Plus manga. Fire Punch, Fujimoto's other serialization, ended after 83 chapters. Hell's Paradise, created by an assistant to Fujimoto, ended after 127 chapters. In this case, I might say Hell's Paradise is a good reference since Part 2 is well beyond 83 chapters. Plus, it's a slower story than Part 1. So since Part 1 was 97 chapters, Part 2 ending after 127 chapters does sound pretty reasonable. Which would mean, at the time I'm recording, Part 2 would have about 34 chapters left, and it would end with chapter 224. This would line up with series like Dr. Stone, which was about 230 chapters, and Undead Unluck, which when it ended was also around 230 chapters. On the other hand, Chainsaw Man isn't quite the same. Dr. Stone and Undead Unluck are both stories that have at least one big time skip, but are generally considered to be just one part. While not exactly marketed this way, Chainsaw Man is clearly split into two parts. As of right now, it's sort of in the gray area between a typical serialization and something like JoJo that is split into several parts. Now, in JoJo, most parts up through Stone Ocean consist of 155 chapters. If that's what we're looking at for Chainsaw Man, then Part 2 would end somewhere closer to chapter 252, which doesn't sound like a lot more, but when you consider that there's 52 weeks, and Fujimoto takes more than a few breaks each year, then that's the difference between another year of Part 2 versus almost 2 more years. That being said, I do think we have a pretty solid window for when Part 2 will end. Based on the other manga we talked about, Part 2 will be somewhere between 120 to 150 chapters, bringing Chainsaw Man anywhere to 225 to 250-ish chapters. Then again, this all depends on how many arcs Part 2 has left, which brings us back to the question of how it will end. Now, real quick before I get into that, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video. You'll get exclusive perks like custom emojis and badges, and you can even pick which manga I cover next. But like I was saying, now that we have a basic timeline for Part 2, we need to figure out what's actually left in the story. First of all, we need to deal with the immediate threat. I know there's a bunch of people that want to see like the return return of Nayuta, the return of power, the journey to hell, the list goes on. But those are under the umbrella of maybe. Like, they might happen, but we don't know. But we do know that the Chainsaw Man Church was the biggest threat to the story, so before part 2 ends, they need to be stopped for good. And who ran the Chainsaw Man Church? There's Barum, who seems like he's dead, and then there's Fami. And if you recall, we already know their goal. In chapter 146, Barum explained that he and Fami were working together to stop the Great King of Terror. Nayuta then explained that the so-called Great King of Terror was the eldest sister of the Four Horsemen, Death, and that she is probably coming to the living world. So their plan, presumably, is to strengthen the War Devil and Chainsaw Man so that they can take down the Death Devil. This sort of arc would resolve any questions about Chainsaw Man, it would answer most of our questions about Fami and what her true plans are, and it would probably resolve any issues between Chainsaw Man and the Chainsaw Devil. So here's how I see the end of Chainsaw Man Part 2. I think we have one major arc left, with the possibility of 1 or 2 more arcs before and after. Considering the recent arc just ended and considering it's almost 40 chapters long, I think it's safe to say that the supposed Death Devil arc will be at least 40 chapters. And that's how I think Part 2 will end. But that just leaves us with one final question. What about Chainsaw Man Part 3? First off, we should talk about whether Part 3 will even happen. Because if you follow the manga, then you know the story is pretty good right now. And if you watched the anime, then odds are you thought it was pretty good. But if you follow Chainsaw Man in the context of the broader community, things aren't as great. Weekly discourse for the manga is still alive, but it's certainly not as active as it used to be. And this is due to a lot of reasons, like Chainsaw Man not being the hot news story it was before, people moving on to newer series, older fans dropping the series because they want to binge it later, or they just don't like Part 2. But one polarizing topic when it comes to Chainsaw Man is the matter of the anime's performance. To be clear, the anime was a mainstream success. It was one of, if not the most popular anime the year it came out, and despite people complaining about the visuals, it looks absolutely gorgeous. That being said, there is still a question of whether it can be called a financial success. MAPPA mostly used their own money for this project, and admitted after season 1 that while they did make a profit, they didn't make what they were expecting to. In addition, manga sales didn't see an increase like we've seen with other big series like Demon Slayer or My Hero Academia. In fact, they've actually been printing less and less copies of the new volumes. On the other hand, they are adapting the Reze arc in the form of a movie, and it's not common for an anime to get its own movie after just 1 season. So while the sales might not be the best right now, it seems like MAPPA and SHUEISHA both have confidence in the future of the series. So in terms of the people in charge, it's definitely possible to get a Part 3. Of course, it's also up to the main man himself, Fujimoto. And while part of that is decided by whether he wants to even write the story anymore, another part of that is what he would actually write for Part 3. Which brings us back to our big question. What is there left for Denji? Part 1 was obviously the arc where we meet Denji for the first time, where he starts out wanting to chase Makima, and by the end of it, he decides that he wants to be Chainsaw Man. Part 2 starts out with Asa and Yoru and has mostly been about their romance with Denji, and Denji's struggle to overcome his habit of chasing girls instead of facing his problems head on. And while I think the current romantic conflict between Denji and Asa will probably be resolved by the end of Part 2, I think Part 3 has a lot of potential to be the arc where we see what dating life is like for Denji. So to illustrate what I mean, let's assume Denji and Asa beat the Death Devil in Part 2. So now Fami and the church are settled. Public safety is presumably out of the picture for a while. Nayuta might still be dead, but could always come back. So really all we have is Denji, Asa, and Yoru. And there's two ways this can end. They both decide that romance is stupid and they want to solve their problems on their own. Chainsaw Man is over, cue end credits. And that would be fine, but I think I speak for everyone when I say ending with part 2 feels a bit lacking. Think of it like Pokemon. Everyone loves Bulbasaur, but then you find out that it evolves into Ivysaur. And everyone loves Ivysaur at first because, let's face it, who doesn't love transforming monsters? Now, don't get me wrong, Ivysaur is fine. I love Ivy. Well, okay, I love this Ivy. Purely for scientific reasons, of course. Ivysaur, on the other hand, is just sort of okay. My point is that Ivysaur is fine, but you can't help feeling like it's a bit lacking. And you would be right, because Ivysaur is merely the awkward preteen that you meet before Venusaur. And that's what Chainsaw Man Part 2 feels like. Part 1 is kinda like Bulbasaur. You don't know what that thing is, but you just know you want that thing. Then Part 2 happens, and it's really cool at first, but once it's been around for a while, you start to get the feeling that it's time for something else. Not that there's anything wrong with Part 2. Part 2 is perfectly fine, but like in Ivysaur, Part 2 just has this in-the-middle feeling. So option 1 is to end Chainsaw Man right here and now. Option 2 would be to start Part 3 and have it cover the romance between Asa and Denji. And here's why that would be super important. Chainsaw Man is mainly about Denji. Specifically, his struggle with his identity in relation to other people. First, he allowed himself to be controlled by Maki to avoid his own trauma. Then he adopted the Chainsaw Man persona. But recently, he's realized that he always falls into the trap of chasing girls whenever he should be dealing with his own trauma, like the death of his father or the death of Nuyuta. So if you have Denji and Asa start to date, this sets up a whole new storyline where they each balance being vulnerable with facing their own insecurities. And that's why I think Part 3 will happen. We have something like 60 chapters left. Part 2 will probably end with Denji and Asa teaming up to stop death. And based on everything we know, there's plenty of reason to expect a third and final part where we watch these two characters as they struggle to be honest with each other and themselves. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How many chapters do you think we have left? Do you think there will be a part 3? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. Also, don't forget to become a Shonen OG channel member. You get exclusive badges and emojis, you get to pick which manga I cover, and you'll even get credited in future videos. Also check out my other Chainsaw Man videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.